So nominating elections are important to understand. The goal of the nomination is for each political party to choose their nominees for the general election. And this is actually part of the progressive movement of the 20th century, trying to improve, reduce the corruption involved in the proverbial back room filled with smoke and party bosses just choosing the nominees. And that's what we saw in the 19th century was, just party bosses choosing their own puppets to be the candidates. The progressives came along and said, no, we want to have nominating elections. The voters should have a say. And so we do. And so when you look forward to the 2020 general election, President Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee unless, something happens. He's going to be on the ballot. And then the question is, who is the Democrat? So the Democrat will choose their nominee through caucuses and primaries. There'll be a fight. There'll be multiple candidates. Another Republican could challenge Donald Trump in their caucuses and primaries. It tends not to happen a lot with an incumbent. Somebody who already has the job is called an incumbent. They tend not to be challenged, but it's happened before. So a caucus or a primary, these are the two types of nominating elections. The caucus, and that word is used in other ways in political science, but as a caucus election, it's a meeting of political party members, voters, to select the candidates to represent their party in the general election. But it's an actual meeting. They come together, and Iowa is a little strange in the way that they do things. They're the most famous caucus because they're first as a presidential caucus in January of 2020. They will gather to choose. It's almost an entire year process. That's why those of us who pay close attention to politics are exhausted by the time we finally get to the general election, because it's just been going on and on and on and on. So the caucus is a physical meeting. And so that means that it has relatively low voter turnout. There's not a lot of people who want to go to a meeting in January to talk about political party candidates. It tends to be in smaller states, tends to be states with high levels of political socialization, of teaching people that it's important. Iowa school kids learn about the caucus process in their schools, and they, have sample caucuses in their classrooms to kind of learn about the process. But there's a cost. There's a cost to going to the caucus. There's a not a monetary cost, but clearly, if you've got kids, you've got to hire a babysitter. If you work nights, you have to request that day off school or work. There's a commitment to going to a caucus, and so it has lower voter turnout than a primary does. And they tend to be in smaller states like Nevada, Iowa, Minnesota has these caucuses. A primary, which is what most of the states have and California has always had, is a primary, which is just that, initial election where voters choose the candidates to represent their party in the general election. And so the primary is what we use in California. The caucus is a smaller gathering.
This is what we've been leading up to all this time, and for the Republicans, it's a fairly simple matter. They show up on caucus night and they cast their ballots and they count them. For the Democrats, though, this is a process. What that means is that hundreds of precincts all across the state, they will physically gather and divide up based on which candidates they support. So, for example, if we had 100 Democrats in one place, and they divided among 4 different candidates, it might break out like this. Now, if any candidate does not have at least 15% of the support in that room, that candidate is basically declared out of it. The voters, however, can either go home or they can start going to some of the other candidates out there. And that's when you get a lot of talk and a lot of horse trading and a lot of wheeling and dealing, because everyone wants to walk away with the most support for his or her candidate. Once it's settled for the night, though, that precinct will report, as do hundreds of others, to the state level, where a lot of math will be done, and when that math is complete, We will have from both parties the first real indication of how the delegates will be divided and who is actually leading the pack on both sides in the race for the White House.
So there are three types of primaries: closed primary, open primary, and what California has, which is the top to advance. We've had that since 2012. So we haven't had that many elections with it, since it's only every 2 years, but we're starting to get used to it, starting to understand it a little better. Safe seats that are overwhelmingly Republican or overwhelmingly Democrat. We've seen a couple of Republican versus Republican or Democrat versus Democrat runoffs in the general election. The most famous was, 2016. We had a runoff for the United States Senate statewide for that. So Kamala Harris versus Loretta Sanchez, both Democrats. So the types of primaries that we have are going to determine the winners and losers. There are going to be different metrics for the candidates who are running. In a closed primary system, this is sort of the text that you can read, and then I'll show you the visual, whichever one works best for you to understand. But a closed primary is basically the easiest to understand. It's closed to that Republican Party, or that Democratic Party, or that Green Party. So every single political party is going to have its own ballot. Only those voters can vote, and if you're declined to state, you're left out. So back many, many, many years ago, when we had the closed primary, there was no incentive for voters to register as declined to state because you would be left out of all of the primary elections. The closed primary is the one that the political parties like the best. The Republican Party likes that it's closed to only Republicans, and only Republicans are voting. And so what you end up with is the general election. We're trying to find who's the Republican, who's the Democrat, who's the Green Party, who's all of the other political parties. And if it's a safe seat, we know that the Republican is going to win. If we have a district that is 70% registered Republicans, no matter who these other candidates are, the Republican is going to win. So lots of voters say, well, in that case, the closed primary is really where the winner is selected. If we know that the Republican is going to win the safe seat, if we know in all those Democratic primaries the Democrat is going to win the safe seat, then the primary election that chooses who that representative is going to be is really the election that matters. So in a safe Republican seat, is this moderate Republican going to beat this conservative Republican? Is this moderate Democrat going to beat this really liberal Democrat? Well, in a closed primary, no, the moderates don't have a very good chance, because the voters are only those voters from their own political party, and the voters who vote in the primary are going to be the most committed, the most ideological. So the most extremely liberal Democrats are going to show up on primary day and vote for the candidate that they like best, and that's probably going to be somebody more liberal. For Republicans, in a closed primary system, it's probably going to be the more conservative, older, homeowner, more conservative Republicans who are going to go and vote for their candidate. So because we have so many safe seats, that causes a problem. It causes a problem because the rest of the voters are sort of being left out. So people said, well, what about if we had an open primary? What if we said any voter can choose to vote in any primary? And okay, well, that helps. Not really, but it appears to help. One of the problems with this is that on paper it looks good. A Republican can choose to vote in the Democratic primary. A Democrat can choose to vote in the Republican primary. The declined to states can suddenly choose to vote. The cost is that it forces the voter to cross over for the entire election. So if you're voting in the 2020 election for a Democrat for president and a Democrat for Senate and a Democrat for all of these other races, and then you get down to your assembly seat and say, oh, well, I live in a safe Republican district, so I want to vote for the most moderate Republican, you probably aren't going to do that. You're probably, A, not going to be that strategic. Probably B, by the time you figured that out, you're already voting on the ballot. But even if you did, even if you thought all of those things and said all of those things, you probably aren't going to want to give up your choice in the Democratic side to decide who challenges Donald Trump in the presidential election for a rather low-level election. So it turns out that there's not a lot of crossover in the open primary. However, the political parties hate this because they fear that all of these strategic voters are crossing over to sabotage, not to vote for the candidate they like best, but to sabotage their primary process. So the political parties really hate the open primary. So California says, okay, well, the open primary doesn't get enough voters because most of the safe seats are pretty far down the ballot. So the Top 2 Advance was created in California, modeled after a similar primary that is used in Washington and a couple of other states. All voters use the same ballot. So we're going to get rid of this separate ballot process. All voters get the same ballot. And the top 2 vote getters advance to the general election regardless of party. And this is to acknowledge that there are safe seats and therefore the voter should have a choice. It'll be interesting to see if we continue with this. The past couple of elections, there's been some weird outcomes, worry that one party would get shut out of a race and what impact that might have on the rest of the ballot and voter turnout in general. We certainly saw that in 2016 when Kamala Harris and Loretta Sanchez were the 2 Senate candidates, and not a lot of Republicans were excited about that race, and so some of them may have stayed home as a result. There's a lot of factors that drive voter turnout. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. The political parties obviously don't like having to spend money in both elections. In November, they have to spend money to defeat another party, but in a safe district, they can kind of coast to election. So there's a lot of people that are questioning whether or not it's working the way we intended and may see some proposals on the ballot to change it. Because it was voted as an initiative, it would have to be changed as an initiative ballot measure. So we may see some reforms circulating soon.